He is a famous biochemist that taught at Boston University for years. His name is Isaac Asimov. And Isaac Asimov not only taught at Boston University in biochemistry and worked in the field of chemical engineering, he also wrote some science fiction. And in his powers of observations, he made some predictions. He made predictions about what the world would be like 50 years from 1962. And if you do the math, that's 2014. And many of his predictions have come true. I'm just going to read some of them. Some were false, but many were true. He said that communications will become sight and sound, and you will see as well as hear the person you're speaking to on the telephone. And Skype and Google and FaceTime, all those video chatting things, are true. They're not commonplace, but they're true. He said that by 2014, the electroluminescent panels will be in common use. So what are those? Those are the panels that we use on our laptops and we use on our flat screen TV. And they are very experimental. And he said this one, he said that gadgetry will continue to relieve humankind of tedious jobs. Think about that next time you go to the grocery store and clerks scan your items across the computer instead of punching them in. And this one, he said the screen will not only be used for movies and television, but to study books and literature. The Kindle and your computer. He said robots will continue to be in common use. And won't be in common use in 2014, but they will be used for entertainment and simple mathematical problems. That's the calculator, guys. They didn't have a calculator. It's hard to believe in 1962 when someone figured out a problem, they took out a piece of paper and they did the longhand math. And when you go to Disneyland, go to the Pirates of the Caribbean, every one of those characters are robots. He got a lot right, which is makes it kind of amusing. But what struck me as I read his predictions of the future is that he did not predict what humans would be like, what our values would be. He made no prediction whatsoever. And I noticed that's the same with movies like Back to the Future, or more commonly, the Jetsons. Who watched the Jetsons? And in the Jetsons, you have George, who's a man who works 8 hours a day, and his wife Jane, who's a full-time homemaker, and his daughter Judy, who's crazy about boys, and whose interest doesn't venture beyond passions. And there's son Leroy, of course, who's a genius. It's a 1950s family system. And all they did is surround them by modern gadgetries. That's outdated today, isn't it? If we were to do this cartoon today, we certainly would not make Leroy the boy genius and make Judy frivolous and immature. Their intelligence would be hopefully a little bit more equal, and Judy would be preparing herself for a career, and most certainly Jane would be doing more things than working for the Historical Society. She would probably have a job outside the house. We don't make predictions about people in the future because we don't understand what the future will bring. I told the kids, I was shocked because I didn't realize it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. So this is not in the written form of my sermon, but in his prediction, civil rights isn't there. He didn't even see that coming. In fact, when you read his papers, it's almost in 1962, from his very white world that he lived near San Francisco, civil rights wasn't a problem. But he also didn't make predictions about his own life. And he didn't do that because maybe he was intelligent enough to know that life brings surprises. The more interesting question is not what kind of gadgetry we will have. The more interesting question is what will we be like in the future? Because life changes us. When I was studying to be a marriage and family counselor, I remember one of the things in the counseling of marriage couples is that they said that when someone gets married or when someone becomes a couple, if one of the members of the couples refuses to join in the identity of the mutual couple, because the couple has an identity and the individuals do, it's a good indicator the marriage won't last. So you used to be Tom and Jane, but unless you're willing to be Tom and Jane, the two people we invite, something's going to go terribly wrong. The same thing happens when you go to college or graduate school. You take on a different identity, or when you step in your profession. The same thing happens not only in marriage, but in death of a spouse or death of a child. You take on a different identity. The same thing happens when you're in a car accident, like when you have a disability. You have a different identity. The world changes, and your perspective must change in it. This is a passage when the Apostle Paul, when Jesus confronts him with the way Christianity is going to change. And Paul does some things which sets precedents for Christians to do throughout the ages. But Paul has to be willing to change with them. So let's look at the text today, and let's see how it applies to the changes we have in our lives. Paul, as you remember, is preaching in the synagogue. And while he's preaching, he is slandered by saying that he's demeaning the law of Moses, and a big riot breaks out. So he has to go down the stairs and go into the barracks because the Roman guard has been called in. And they're carrying him up front, and he says, you know, if I fall down, I'm going to be manhandled to death. He's probably thinking that. Let me talk to the crowd. And he starts to share his testimony, and the first part of the testimony seems to be accepted. Jesus met me on the road to Damascus. He speaks in Aramaic, which is everyone's language. Oh, good, he's one of us. We can listen. And Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus and says, why are you persecuting me? And Jesus is a holy man. People kind of like that. But then he comes to a point that people don't like. He says, when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking. Quick, he said to me, leave Jerusalem immediately, because they will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these men know that I went from synagogue to synagogue to imprison those and to beat those who believed in you, and the blood of your martyrs, and the word martyr also in Greek is Stephen, it is witness, the blood of your witness. Stephen was shed. I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. I want you to notice that the early church is still meeting and joining in corporate worship in the synagogue. Now, this is not just recorded in the Bible. The Romans saw Christianity as a Jewish sect, and that's why anti-Semitism has no place in the church. They are our grandparents. We built Christianity upon Judaism. In fact, Jesus is the fulfillment of the minor prophets. I'm going to stress that because sometimes when we talk about the mistakes the Hebrew people made in the book of Acts, people have used that for a reason to persecute the Jews. So I want you, when you look at Acts, I want you to think of them as the early church. Because the things they do are the things we do. And the reason it's recorded is because we do the same things. So Paul is meeting in a prayer meeting, and he's in a trance, and I just love the Greek word here. It's a displacement of the mind. He's so deep in prayer. And that's a glorious place to be if you've ever been there. That he's unaware of his own circumstances. And God is talking to him. And when God gives him a message, and that's that, Paul, I know you grew up with these people, and I know these were the people you pictured yourself with the rest of your life, but you need to go to the Gentiles. Now remember, Paul was a Roman citizen of Tarsus and a Pharisee. Now as a Pharisee, he was a lawyer. And the lawyers were trained to do this, to protect Rome, to protect the temple and their law from Rome coming in and polluting it. He, like everyone else, had spent his whole life, keeping the Gentiles at bay so he could preserve the ethnic purity of the law. And it's a beautiful law. And compared to the Roman law, it doesn't hold a candle. The Jewish law is so much more compassionate, so much more dear. And God is telling him, guess what, Paul? Not only am I going to call you away from your home, which is the temple, the kind of worship you like, and you know when you like a certain hymn and a certain scripture, and I'm going to call you to some place that's kind of weird to you. And I want you to go. And Paul's first response is, but I'm not worthy. And I don't think it's an excuse. He persecuted Gentiles. He dragged them into court. And he persecuted the people of the way. And Jesus holds his feet to the fire, so to speak. Jesus says, you're not getting out that easy. If you've ever failed at a task that God has given you to do, join the club. We all do. And I often tell people this when the kids go through confirmation. I say Christianity is learned in the kitchen and in the laundromat and in the grocery store. And I understand those are very imperfect places. Those are the places where someone cuts you off and you slam on your brakes and you may utter an obscenity. Those are the places when someone gets your goats because you're in the wrong line. Those are the places where you have fights with your spouse and your sisters and your brothers and your aunts and uncles. But those are the places where Christianity is born. And Epiphany the Younger said it best. They speak of the wonders by boiling pot and brawling babe. You know, when a pot's boiling over and you're trying to comfort the baby and you're feeling out of control? That's where Christianity is raised. Paul did fail. There's no doubt about that. But God said, these are the people that you minister best to. And so, Jesus continues the vision to Paul. And then the Lord said to me, go, and I will send you to the Gentiles. And the crowd listened to Paul until he said this, and they raised their voices and shouted, rid him of the earth, he's not fit to live. And as they were shouting, they were flinging off their coats and flinging their dust in the air. And the commander ordered Paul to be taken into the barracks, and he directed him to be flogged and questioned in order to find out why these people were shouting like this. So, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, are fine with this new gospel until Paul says, I'm one of you, and guess what? Other people are one of you. And we do the same things. Their territory is threatened. That happens all the time in church. I said this morning that I had forgotten, and it was on the news today, and I would have done more research on it. But one of the things that Martin Luther King studied while he was in seminary was he studied how Christians in the past, in Rome and the Apostle Paul, used the law to stand up for their civil rights. It seems like, we're going to find out as this text, in Rome, the color of the skin wasn't a big deal. Your language was a big deal. Your language was the big deal, and also, not only was your language, but your education and your citizenship. And in some ways, I think that comes back to us today, because still within the church, I've been in really big churches and also small churches where someone's more educated or richer, they're thought of this way, and someone's not as rich, they're thought of that way. And Paul's bringing everybody together. And Paul's saying in so many words that he's flinging open the doors. But when Martin Luther King Jr. studied this passage, he also lectured about it before his protests, that Paul used the law to defend himself. But people do feel threatened when their territory is threatened. And the immediate response is to put their guard up. And it's the job of the church to be fluid and to be changing to what God is doing in the land. I've studied a lot about music, and this happens again and again when people talk about how wonderful the hymns are. And I like the hymns we just sung. But when Wesley started to write those hymns, they were considered modern contemporary music. And they wanted the Anglican hymns. And I love Anglican hymns, but good luck trying to sing them. They're 5-part harmony, and they're very formal. And when you hear them, you're astounded by them, but it's not like singing what we sing Gentle Shepherd up there. It's a little tough. And so the contemporary music coming into the church today is just another standard of that. But they felt their authority threatened. And why did they throw dust into the air? It was a Hebrew custom that when you left a Gentile home or a home of a non-believer, before you went into your home, you flung out your coat to shake the dust off, to shake the attitude off. It was like a spiritual wiping your feet. Don't bring those attitudes and that morality into my home. Wipe your feet off. And you may have said that to your kids. You may hear that language at school, but not in this house. Or that's the way they treat people over there, but not here. So they're at this point they're saying that they're challenging Paul that maybe he's not really a religious person because he wants that Gentile, these Gentiles there. But Paul continues to preach while this crowd's getting angry. Paul's sermon is just not for the people, but it's for the Roman centurion who was deathly frightened of Jerusalem revolting against Rome. And he's saying, we're not interested in revolting one people group. I'm not one of the people that said the Messiah is just for our race to rise up and take over Rome. But this is for anyone who professes Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Now, the guard asked him to be scourged. And you might wonder that. And sadly, it's true that in the Roman Empire, before they would question anyone, you were guilty until proven innocent, not innocent until proven guilty. You were scourged. And the scourging was a thong, and at the end of the thong, leather thongs, there were glass, and there was bone, and it would whip into your flesh and into your back. Paul is, if you want to look at the passage later, talks that he's received this beating several times in 2 Corinthians 11:23 through 27. He's not a coward as far as this beating goes. He's familiar with them, he understands them, although it would have been a crisis indeed. But Paul brings up his Roman citizen to stop the scourging. But that's going to be a mistake in the long end, because that's going to bring him to a bad end. And you have to wonder, why does he bring it up? And I don't think it's to stop the scourging, although the scourging is a painful thing. I think it's for another reason. So let's look at the text. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" And when the centurion reported it, he said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Well, this man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," said Paul. The commander said, "Well, I had to pay a big price for my citizenship, but I was born a citizen," Paul said. And those who were about ready to question him withdrew immediately. And the commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. The next day, the commander wanted to find out exactly what Paul was being accused of by the Jews. So then he released him and ordered the chief priest and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. And they brought Paul and had him stand there before him. Cyril, we have his writings. He was near the 1st century. And he spoke about that it was against the law to bind a Roman citizen in chains. And it was a crime to arrest him without a trial before a Roman magistrate, and it was considered murder to kill him without a trial. So Paul brings up his Roman citizenship because that would force them to give a trial. But the trial would be whether he was worshiping a Roman insurrectionist, Jesus Christ, which he would be found guilty of. Paul asking for a trial is signing his death papers. He's going to die, and he knows that. Why does he bring up his Roman citizenship? And I think there's a reason for that. He does it as an example to believers who would suffer in the future for fighting for justice. Paul is saying there's a law of the land and we need to obey it. And the early Christians did that for 300 years. They went to their deaths, but they were not sadomasochistic. They went protesting and quoting the Roman law, not because they were cowards, but because they wanted to stand up for those who are persecuted. And that tradition comes down to us today through people like Martin Luther King. In his letters from the Birmingham jail, he talks about because it's illegal and there's injustice here. And justice is the same as righteousness. He stands up for justice. We don't tell people just to suffer because that's the way it is. I had an example this last week that I really struggled with, but I'm going to share it with you anyway because it just applies to me. I went to a clergy reading group at my lunch break. A group of clergy were meeting and reading scriptures and theology. And I was the only woman in the group. And they were talking Bodie, he's a theologian. And one of the men in the group, who did not believe women should be ordained, when it came to my turn to talk, and said, "So Cheryl, which one of Jane Austen's is your favorite story?" And he did it to put me down. And I teared up and I said, I like the movies, but I really don't read Jane Austen. I really like Kierkegaard and Luther. And I tried to come back, but I couldn't. And when I was talking to someone else, they said, "Oh, he's just like that. You've got to put up with it." Well, we don't have to put up with it. When we see it in our midst, whatever it is, it's our job to say, "Don't do that. That's not what God would do." And I'm so thankful for the people the women who chained themselves to gates for my right to vote. And the women who first had death threats when they signed up to go to seminary. And I'm thankful for Frederick Douglass, who the rest of his life looked over his shoulder. And for other people who stood up and said, "This is wrong." George Washington Carver. We're not going to do it this way anymore. Because in their lifetimes, they didn't see the fulfillment of the promise. But they fought for it, and that's what Paul's doing. He's making a statement. Christianity would not be legal for the next 300 years, but he does it to fight for justice. And he does it to gain a greater platform for the gospel. He's going to go out with a bang. Because he's a Roman citizen from Tarsus, which is a prominent city, he's going to end up having to go to Rome to be tried. And that's going to get a lot of people's noses out of joint. And he does it in a sense to find a sense that everyone knows that Christianity will not be lived out quietly. But I also think he does it, and there's a lesson here, to avoid from being torn apart from the crowd. And there's self-care here. And he sticks up for himself. And we do the same. Just because we turn the other cheek, it doesn't mean we let people walk all over us. We say this is the law. It's a curious thing that the Roman soldier shames Paul. And it's Paul's language, because he speaks such a good Greek, a fine form of Greek, that convinces them. But he says, "I had to pay a big price for my Roman citizenship." In other words, I think that you're pulling the blinds over my eyes. I don't think you're Roman. You're not dressed like one. You don't act like one. And when Paul talks back to him in the Greek, it's very fine Greek. So he went from talking slang to speaking very clear Greek, so he knew that he was a citizenship. Paul was called to go to Rome to take the gospel to the Gentiles, and he didn't think he was the best to do that. But the reality was Peter was the best to minister to the Jewish people because he had no conflict. He didn't speak Greek, he just spoke Hebrew. And Paul was the best, and James was the best, but Paul was the best to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So Cheryl, where do we take this in the here and now? This is a change of vision. I used to think that when we grew up, and I think television movies helps us, that we go through the stormy time in adolescence, then we grow up and we find our identity, that it's easy selling and nothing changes. And do you guys feel like it's easy selling? We're changing constantly, aren't we? And we're going to change to the day we die. So when you get a roadblock, and God says, "Okay, this is the road you're taking now," allow God to mold your identity. And every time there's a different road, some of your failings are going to come up. And that's one of the things therapists talk about in transitions. One of the reasons why weddings and funerals, or even Christmas, can be a hard time is when families go through transitions, old conflict comes up in the transition. Well, personally, that conflict comes up. And learn to give that conflict to Jesus again. Allow God to mold you. Don't let your vision of your life supersede God's vision of your life. All of us are stronger than we think. And that's just the reality. All of us are. And some of the things we've gone through, if we could have known the future, we'd say, I never could go through that. But you're all stronger than you think. And you're strong enough even to face that final trial when you leave this body and go to be with Jesus. I realize I did it. There we go. And God uses our full history, not just the pretty parts. And that's one of the things I love about Christianity. I was talking to a professional chiropractor with a bunch of other friends the other day, and he was talking about, he wanted, because I was a pastor, about spiritual alignment. That even though when you align someone, the body will never be the same, but in some ways the body realigns itself so it's even better suited for the person. And I said that would be the definition of redemption. God buys back us from slavery, and we still have the scars of sin in our life and others' lives, which is the sin of slavery. But God can use those. So I'm going to sing, the song we're going to sing is Be Strong in the Lord. And that's when the Israelites were about ready to go over to the promised land. And they said, but Joshua, we can't. We're used to the desert. And Joshua's response was, be strong in the Lord and be of good courage. You can and you will. So as we sing that today, I pray that you'll see that in your life, in whatever God's doing in your life. And you'll find the mercy and strength to see you through. Brothers and sisters, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God will last forever. Thanks be to God.